So, Robby, what's on your radar?
Well, remember the right-wing militia members who allegedly plotted to kidnap Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer because of her COVID-19 lockdown policies? Well, they will go to trial in just a few weeks. 6 of them were charged in connection with the plot, and one of them has already pleaded guilty and is expected to testify against the rest. State authorities charged 8 others with aiding a terrorist plot. The government's case against these 14 alleged extremists relies on work done by at least a dozen government informants and undercover FBI agents whose extensive involvement in the plot calls into question whether it would have moved forward at all without the government's prodding. Some of these government actors took lead roles in organizing the supposed plot. One of the informants was even paid $54,000 by the FBI. Taken together, these and other details raise the strong possibility that the militia members were victims of entrapment on the part of the FBI. Indeed, the revelations have prompted considerable welcome scrutiny of the case from the mainstream media. The FBI investigation into the alleged plot to kidnap Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer has gotten very complicated, conceded BuzzFeed News in a terrific in-depth examination of the available evidence that was published last month. And earlier this week, the New York Times acknowledged that the involvement of informants and agents had, quote, muddled the case. The Times reports, quote, on a rainy night in northern Michigan in September 2020, a group of armed men divided among 3 cars surveyed the landscape around the vacation cottage of the governor, considering how to kidnap her as payback for her COVID lockdown measures. Of the dozen men on that nighttime surveillance mission, 4 of them, including Big Dan, were either government informants or undercover FBI agents, according to court documents. Big Dan was no passive spectator. After initially alerting the authorities that he was involved in a Facebook group for militia members in which violence against police officers had been discussed, he agreed to become an informant. The government paid him $54,000 for 6 months of work, and when the militia group surveilled Whitmer's vacation home, it was Big Dan leading the charge. According to the group's defense attorneys, Big Dan, an Iraq War veteran, took charge of training the other men in military tactics. And that's not all. Big Dan's FBI handler, this guy, Jason Chambers, well, he had a side hustle. Chambers was attempting to build a security consulting business in the midst of the investigation. It's easy to see how his desire to create a brand for himself could have led him to encourage Big Dan to nudge the plot along. BuzzFeed obtained a resume that Chambers had shared with prospective clients, and in that document, he took credit for using, quote, online undercover techniques to investigate terrorist groups. According to BuzzFeed, Chambers has a long history of participating in FBI investigations of Muslim youths who were enticed by law enforcement to become involved in wholly theoretical violent plots, according to their defense attorneys. Chambers is no longer slated to participate in the trial. Another government asset, Stephen Robison, worked as an informant during the investigation, but is no longer involved after pleading guilty to various felonies. The government's star witness, FBI agent Robert Trask, was fired by the agency after beating his wife following an orgy at a swingers party. Suffice it to say, it's very hard to tell the cops from the criminals in this case. The court may determine that none of this matters, of course. They might say that even though the defendants were clearly goaded into action by the very law enforcement agents seeking to ensnare them, they still made the colossally stupid decision to proceed. Historically, victims of entrapment have had a tough time prevailing, no matter how duplicitously the FBI behaved. But in any case, it is now abundantly clear that Whitmer was in no real danger. At all stages of the alleged plot, the FBI was aware of every facet of it. Their agents and informants were intimately involved, not just surveilling the militia members, but actively offering guidance on how to pull off the kidnapping. Yet Whitmer has become a more sympathetic figure on the national stage because she is perceived as a victim of former President Donald Trump's reckless rhetoric and emboldening of right-wing domestic terrorists. Quote, every time the president ramps up his violent rhetoric, every time he fires up Twitter to launch another broadside against me, my family, and I see a surge of vicious attacks sent our way, wrote Whitmer in an Atlantic article titled The Plot to Kidnap Me. The thrust of her piece is that Trump's criticism of blue state governors inspires real violence, and she very much cites herself as a potential victim of such a thing. Here was Whitmer speaking about Trump's complicity in the kidnapping plot.
Just last week, the President of the United States stood before the American people and refused to condemn white supremacists and hate groups like these 2 Michigan militia groups. Stand back and stand by, he told them. Stand back and stand by. Hate groups heard the President's words not as a rebuke, but as a rallying cry.
Now, Trump undoubtedly said many things that were cruel, vile, wrong. But the person most responsible for the Whitmer kidnapping plot is clearly not Trump. What's the FBI agent who greenlit this farce? Ironically, Whitmer thanked them in that same speech.
I want to start by saying thank you to our law enforcement. Thank you to the fearless FBI agents. And thank you to the brave Michigan State police troopers who participated in this operation.
Many conservatives have unfortunately become committed to the idea that the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol was not the work of Trump supporters, but rather elements of the so-called deep state. Now, there's no evidence of that. The Capitol riot is one of the clearer cases of Trump's incautious remarks leading to actual mayhem. The Whitmer kidnapping plot, on the other hand, well, it was extensively directed and encouraged by agents of the government. It's a much, 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 much more persuasive case of deep state nefariousness. So, you're reading these details and you're like, everyone involved in this is working for the government, is encouraging it. Like, this was just, it truly was just people, blowing off steam, not even in terms of actions, just in their words, just in what they're saying in this Facebook group. And then it spirals from there, but it spirals because the FBI causes it to spiral. So, the idea that, and look, you can still say these people are guilty because they were going along with it. I don't know what a court will say. Entrapment's very difficult to prove. The previous cases where I've thought this is clearly entrapment, the person still gets convicted because it, has to do with a guilty mind kind of determination. And what is the inclination that they were willing to engage in violence? It's very easy to prove that to a judge, to a jury. But all that aside, there's just she was never in any danger. She was never in a shred of danger.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting that it's very easy for people on the left to understand how disgusting this is when they do it to Muslims, and it is disgusting when they do it to Muslims, but when they do it to people who are conservatives, it's a little bit harder. You see the same people sort of drumming up the hysteria around the domestic terrorism threat, when often what ends up happening is, yes, they went along with it. Yes, January 6th was violent, but at the same time, is it evidence of mass domestic terrorism coming from the right? I don't think it is. I think it's, there's a lot of effort being put into trying to criminalize being conservative and trying to drum it up as a form of terrorism. And I feel like, more people should be able to condemn that when it's happening to both sides. Yeah,
my people, the libertarians, progressive liberals have, for years, for decades, been so wary of how the term terrorist has, it has expanded to just kind of include to imperil all Muslims, to impugn all Muslim people, to include all categories of crime, even if they're not really politically motivated, and even if they're like, what is this term? It's a term that the government wants to use because it gives them more power. And now we're seeing some in the Democratic camp embracing it because it's being used against the people they don't like, very conservative MAGA Republicans.
Yeah, people standing up to the very things we were talking about before, to overreach when it comes to COVID restrictions.
Yes.
They've sort of essentially criminalized, people who want to say, look, we have our liberties, we have our rights. So I'm so glad you brought this story up because it's it is terrible, but there's like a farcical element to it as well that's kind of hilarious.
Arrested after violence, after an orgy. And the person, so the Big Dan, which is this is a pseudonym for whoever this person is. So he's being paid by the government, and then his FBI handler is clearly trying to start a business where he wants to be like, oh, I'm the terrorism catcher. I'm the guy who got all these people. Like, it would be so good for his business to push this into a bigger thing that he's the one who busts. Like, that's so that motivation is so transparent, which is why he's no longer involved in the case at all. So I don't know. Maybe the court will look at all of those things. So when you read the New York Times story, the first half of it is like all these damning kind of facts, and then somewhere in it is like, and that's what the prosecution's saying. The defense is saying, like, wait, that's the prosecution.
Right, totally. I think it also reveals another thing about our cultural moment, which is that, Whitmer's profile rose when she was revealed to have been
yes.
the victim of this plot. And I think that you're seeing that more and more. You saw that with Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez when she was talking about, how afraid she was during the Capitol riot when it turned out she was in a different building altogether. But this idea that you get sort of cultural clout from, being the victim of somebody else's violence. And I of course we should people who are victims of violence, they deserve our sympathy, they deserve our attention. But at the same time, there's this new move that politicians seem to be pulling in order to, get clout, get position, get sympathy. And this story really brings that out, I think.
And you could just say, if you don't like the things Donald Trump says, and I don't like some of them, you can just say, that was a bad thing. He should not have said that. You don't have to say, and people are dying literally because of these words, which is just so much harder to prove in most of the cases. Anyway, I'm looking forward to what's on your radar coming up next.